Today I'm going to be showing you the Vivotek FE8172V. This, of course, is the bigger brother of the FE8171V. Both these cameras make use of fisheye lenses, but there are a couple of key differences between them. Firstly, the FE8172V is a second generation camera, which means that a lot of improvements have been made to the firmware of the camera. This in turn leads to a more refined camera that better allocates its resources towards video processing, and it allows for a much smoother user interface and video viewing experience. The second key difference is the fact that this model is a 5 megapixel as opposed to the 3 megapixel 8171. This allows for much more detail to be obtained from an image, and where visual identification with a lower resolution camera might be difficult, a 5 megapixel image allows for much more detail to be viewed by digitally zooming into the image either while viewing the camera live or after the footage has been recorded. The new 5 megapixel camera can also do 3 megapixel resolutions, but since this is a second generation camera, it can do 3 megapixels at 30 frames per second, whereas the normal FE8171 can only do 3 megapixels at 15 frames per second. At a full 5 megapixel resolution, however, the 8172 does 15 frames per second. This might sound a bit low, but if you think about it, unless you're monitoring a very fast moving object such as a car, a high frame rate is usually wasted. But since this image is still very high quality, you will get excellent amounts of detail. Typically, installers prefer a frame rate that is even lower, due to bandwidth limitations. So why do we need to make use of fisheye cameras? One of the biggest benefits is that we are not bound to a narrow field of view. On traditional cameras, the field of view is typically very narrow and focused onto a certain point. With fisheye cameras, we can have a 360-degree field of view when mounted to a ceiling, or 180-degree field of view when mounted to a wall. Another big benefit comes into play when we start making use of the ePTZ functionality. On traditional PTZ cameras, if you're looking at a certain direction, all the footage that is next to and behind where you're looking is lost. With this fisheye camera, the entire 360-degree view is recorded the entire time. This means, no matter where you're looking at the time, you can always go back afterwards and check what you missed. You might be thinking that it is difficult to view a 360-degree image and that you lose perspective. For this reason, Vivotek has added the capability to de-warp the image. By making use of this feature, the image that you're looking at can resemble the more traditional look of an IP camera. The software on this Vivotek camera also allows for the image to be split into several smaller viewing windows, which each resembles the traditional view of a camera. It is in this way possible to have one camera look into several different directions. Fisheye cameras are especially effective for replacing multiple standard cameras due to their very wide field of view. So let's take a look at some of the other nice features that this camera has on offer besides the fisheye capability. The first thing that you'll probably notice is that this is the 8172V. The V in this case indicates that this is a vandal-proof camera. This makes it ideal for public areas where vandalism might be a problem, or even prisons and transportation applications, such as buses, etc. What makes this camera vandal-proof is the fact that it has non-standard screws, which means that a normal screwdriver will not work on it. And also, the camera makes use of a very strong outer housing, which normally consists of polymer and metal. This camera also has the capability to be used with a micro SD card, which essentially allows the device to be used in standalone applications and the video footage to be referenced at a later stage. Another nice feature of this device is that it has wide dynamic range. Wide dynamic range allows you to use the camera in situations where backlight might make it difficult to get a clear image. Wide dynamic range, or WDR, basically finds the most underexposed and overexposed parts of the image and then tries to find a point in the middle that will give you the best image quality. These cameras also have an IR cut filter, which makes night viewing possible. So next, let's take a look at the user interface for this camera, and we'll also take you through a brief setup procedure. Although the user interface looks similar on most Vivotek cameras, there are a couple of key points that are unique to this specific device. The first thing we will need to do is find the camera. Remember that these cameras do not come with static IP addresses. Instead, you will need to find them using the Installation Wizard 2 program, which will search for the device based on MAC addresses. This program can be found on the disk that accompanies the camera. Once you've found the device you're looking for, simply double-click on it and it should take you to the camera's web interface. Once inside the camera's web interface, you should have a layout that looks similar to this. If you have an image that looks out of proportion, click on the Auto tab at the top to have an image that looks closer to what we are looking at the moment. One of the nice features when installing the camera is the fact that we do not need to focus it. By default, your camera should be in focus. So in the top left corner, you'll notice an option that says Display Mode. This option is unique to the fisheye cameras and is used to change the orientation of the view. By default, it should have a 360-degree field of view. If you click on the drop-down menu, you will notice that there are a couple of options. The first view mode is 1.0, which is what we are looking at the moment. The next is 1P. This changes the layout of the image to a 180-degree field of view. This view is most helpful when mounted to a wall. The next option is 1R. This view resembles the more traditional view of an IP camera. The difference here is that if you click and drag with your mouse on the image, it will use EPTZ to change the view. All the rest of the options in the drop-down menu are simply different combinations of the various view types. You can play around with these views to find the one that best suits you. We also have all the traditional options that are present on most Vivotek cameras, such as video stream selection, manual recording triggers, snapshots, etc. Again, feel free to experiment with these options. So next, let's go and play with the setup of the camera. To do that, click on the Configuration tab at the top. Next, we want to click on the Advanced tab on the left. By default, the camera will be in basic mode, and in that way it hides a lot of the features that we want to access. The first window that should appear automatically is the General Settings window under the Systems tab. Inside this window we have the option to rename our camera, which by the way is something that I would greatly recommend that you do, since it will be easier to reference later. We also have the option to change the time in this window. Again, I would highly recommend this, since we will later enable the time and date overlay, and if the time and date is set up incorrectly, it might end up causing you troubles when trying to use the footage in a court or for reference purposes. We can choose to set up the time manually, have it synchronized with our computer's time and date, or automatically by using an NTP server. Contained in the Systems tab, there are a couple of additional options which is not necessary to discuss right now. The one we are, however, interested in is the Maintenance tab at the bottom. When you click on the Maintenance tab, you will notice an option to upgrade firmware. I would recommend that you log into Vivotek's webpage at this point and download the latest firmware for this camera. Next, you simply click on the Browse tab, point it towards the downloaded firmware, and then click on Upgrade. It's very important to keep the firmware up to date, since new features and improvements are added over time. Also, if you want to set your camera back to default settings, in case you did something wrong, simply click on the Restore button. Next, we want to click on the Media tab, and then on Image. First, we have the option to show the video name and timestamp in the video and snapshots. This can be important in certain cases where it is required by law. Be sure to check on this with your local authorities. Next, we need to select the mounting type. This is important, since it will change the orientation of the image. Be sure to select the corresponding mounting type. We can also choose to have the image displayed either in black and white mode or in color. The next option is quite important. Power line frequencies differs across the world, and the effect is that it is sometimes possible to see lines running up and down across the video feed. Change this setting to eliminate that problem. We also have the option to flip the image around in case it was mounted upside down, and we can choose to mirror the image as well. Next, you can go ahead and click on the Image Settings tab. It will be up to you to play with these settings to get the best looking image. At the bottom, we have an option to enable WDR as mentioned before. Use this feature in high contrast lighting conditions. Next, we click on the Exposure tab. Again, these exposure settings will need to be determined by yourself based on your lighting conditions. Be aware though that certain exposure settings can lead to a lower frame rate. We also have a couple of options in here to enable or disable the camera's day-night mode, as well as having the camera trigger an external I/O illuminator from its I/O ports. Always remember to click on the Save button at the bottom after any changes have been made, or otherwise they will be lost. So let's go ahead and click on the Video button under the Media tab. The first option you'll have here is the option to choose between full 5MP fisheye mode at 15 frames per second or 30 frames per second at 1080p. You will have to determine whether you want a higher quality image or the ability to view faster moving objects in real time. The choice will be determined by your environment type. Next, you can click on the Stream tab. This camera has 3 concurrent live streams, and you are capable of selecting different encoding types, etc. for each. This is effective if you want a live view stream at a certain frame rate and resolution, and a recording stream with different settings. By default, your camera and most VMSs will display Stream 1, so let's go ahead and change the settings there. Now we have the option to select our encoding type. Each encoding type will have a key advantage over the other, and again, the type you use will be determined by your requirements. JPEG will, for example, offer more image quality, but use more storage space, and H.264 will offer a lower image quality, but it uses a lot less resources. Inside this tab, we can select the image size, frame rate, keyframe period, and our video quality. The image size tab allows you to choose how large the output image is. You can reduce this setting in order to use lower amounts of bandwidth and storage. Below that is the frame rate. Again, you can lower this setting for bandwidth and storage requirements. The intra-frame period, also known as the keyframe period, relates to the video encoding type, and it basically determines how often the camera needs to capture one complete image. The video quality tab is quite important, since it will ultimately have a large effect on how well your image looks. You can choose to have a constant bitrate, which will mean that your camera will stick to a certain bitrate. If average is selected, the camera might slightly exceed the limitation depending on complexity of scene. When upper bound is selected, it means that the maximum bitrate allowed is the target bitrate, which in this case is 4 megabits per second. This is important if you only have a limited amount of network bandwidth available. If fixed quality is selected, the camera will try to find the best trade-off between quality and bandwidth, depending on what you set it on. It is recommended to play with these settings to see which one gives you the best result. The last thing we want to do is set the camera to a static IP address. To do that, click on Network, and then General Settings. A static address will be much easier to reference later and easier to map to a VMS system. Once inside General Settings, you simply click on Use Fixed IP Address, and you can then change the address to meet your network requirements. There are a whole host more settings that can be done on these cameras, but in terms of basic setup, this is pretty much it. The last thing I wanted to mention quickly is to remember that these cameras do come with a free VMS platform called FE8172V, which allows for up to 32 cameras to be viewed completely free. And that's it. For more information, please visit www.myro.co.za. Thanks for watching.